So ISO is actually not an acronym, as everybody thinks it is. ISO is actually the short name for the International Organization for Standardizations. So a lot of people then ask, why is it called ISO? Shouldn't it be called IOS? And actually, unfortunately, it actually derives from the Greek word isosis, which means equal to. And to be able to understand this, you'll have to perhaps go back into the 18th century, where the first person, as far as history can take us back, was Lord Kelvin, who established a standard for geometrical product specifications in terms of degrees Celsius, Kelvin, Fahrenheit, and the changing thereof. And then early 20th century, that's when Henry Ford started using standards in terms of being able to ensure there's a level of consistency when it comes to manufacturing products. The problem came in after World War II, when countries were trading with one another, and each country had their own national standards. For example, the South African Bureau of Standards have their own national standards known as the South African National Standards. We've got SANS codes for window frames, door frames, you name it. And those are created by technical committee members within the SABS themselves, or experts in the field in South Africa that participate voluntarily to create these standards. Once it's adopted, it belongs to the SABS with the intellectual property. Now, after World War II, when countries started trading with one another, the problem became where the perception was, if it was coming from a Swiss company or a Swiss country, then obviously the standard was more superior, even that being from a German country or company. But if it was coming from South Africa, or if it was coming from China, or any other developing country for that matter, it was denoted as to be poorer quality. So that's where basically this particular constraint was then given to the United Nations, who created a forum called International Accreditation Forum to listen to the voices with regards to the constraint of trade came in when it came to trading or products that were the same particular level. And that's when they decided that there needs to be a mandate to standardize standards. And that's where the birth of the International Organization for Standardizations in the late 1940s was established. It was initially created and established in the United Kingdom. And one of the key founders of the ISO family of standards was the British. But also what's unique to know is that the SABS were also members and founders of the particular ISO standards. It started off with 30 member countries, where each country would send a representative of their national standard and technical committee member, who would then debate it with the other 30 countries, and they would then adopt an international standard, which will elevate up to an ISO standard. And that basically is what gives you an indication of the benefit of ISO. It's best practice standard that's created by multiple bodies who own the standards in their country, who sit together to be able to create a level of standardizations, consistency. So when it comes to trade, when it comes to your plugs, when it comes to window frames, door frames, there's a level of consistency. And that's basically what ISO does. Their fundamental approach is to help standardize standards. They own the ISO standards, which is the intellectual property. And those are the standards we use to be able to help facilitate trade across the world and give assurance to companies that we are following best practice standards. I hope that made sense. So I think the question is more around what exactly is required for policies to be established, because a lot of companies feel we may just create policies for the sake of creating policies. I think there's a hierarchy in which we need to understand the policies and thereafter understand the value of implementing these policies. So I'll start off with a hierarchy. If, for example, in South Africa, there is a law with regards to you needing to comply to, for example, the National Environmental Management Act, which talks about air quality, water quality, waste management, all of those particular fundamentals are written out in there. Now, if the law says you must have a policy, it's not negotiable for any company. You have to have the policy in place. But the policy needs to be short, concise, and needs to be aspirational commitment statements to say what top management is going to be doing or what they will be doing to be able to comply to the requirements of the particular legislation. Now, if, for example, the law doesn't say you need to have a policy, then the next part of the hierarchy is the regulation that you need to conform to, maybe best practice standards, national codes, or international standards. And if that is a requirement where you need to have a policy in place and it gives you a set of requirements on how to write the policy, then go ahead and have it. But the third one is the most critical. So let's say the statutory, the law doesn't say you should have it. The regulatory, the standards or best practice frameworks like ISO standards that you need to conform to does not say you need to have it. Then the organization needs to determine whether or not there's a risk associated with environmental controls in their organization. The risk is associated with how you manage waste, how you are hurting the depletion of the ozone layer. It also looks at your air quality, water quality, emissions. All of those factors are considered. Now, when you look through the risk assessment and you identify the activities that are being performed in your day-to-day business and they have a negative impact to the environment, that is where I think you need to start coming up with policies to create a culture in the organization to be able to ensure that we can be able to have easier breathing air. I mean, a long time ago, people thought masks would be something of, what you'd watch in the movie, for example. But now you see everyone walking around with masks. But that's because of the COVID-19 pandemic. How do we not know that in the near future, we will be wearing masks because the air that we're breathing is polluted? And that is because of industrialization. We need to be careful with regards to building economies with fossil fuels on that, which can have an impact to the depletion of our environment as well as ozone layer. And that's where the policies come in. If you feel that your company, your country does not have a culture of being able to look after the environment and follow certain laws, then the advice is to then create policies set out by top management with stringent regulations to say if you don't conform to these policies, there may be disciplinary acts, actions that may take place, there may be fines that may be imposed, like by the Green Scorpions, who is a regulatory body in South Africa that ensures that we are doing things within the law of the environment. So policies are significantly important following that hierarchy, but based on the risk associated with the organization. And it's a fundamental tool to help companies build a culture to improve environmental performance. So we've got different modes of training at WWISE. We're an accredited training provider, and what we have is different ways of being able to showcase what the importance of the ISO 14001 standard is all about, as well as the National Environmental Management Act is all about. The first way we do it is where we have physical face-to-face training, where you come to our training premises and we actually train you on the fundamentals of what ISO is, what 14001 is, what is an environmental aspect, what is an environmental impact, what is environmental performance, and what do you need to do to implement an effective environmental management system in your organization, very high level. We also talk about different types of pollution, waste management, and also look at the positives and how companies through case studies have looked at recycling and changing a risk into an opportunity to be able to be the betterment of their organization, as well as scoring fundamental points in the stock market to give the confidence to the shareholders that they're meeting requirements. So you have the face-to-face training, you have virtual training as we're doing now over Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Then you have another product called e-learning, where you can actually log on to via a website and choose a course and then pay via payment gateway. And then you get the course where the content is changed into infographics, more like videos. So it's very difficult to interpret what the law says. It's very difficult to interpret what the standard says. So we've tried to create videos and animation to be able to allow everyone to understand, or laymen to understand, the context of what environmental is, what pollution is, what recycling is, and make it interactive, where you can be able to interact with the particular content and do summative assessments. The license is valid for 1 year, and it's about 8 hours of runtime. And you can choose to do 10 minutes today, 1 hour next day. You can do it as your own pleasure. And at the end, you have a short assessment to give you an indication of how well you've understood the particular content and the comprehension of the particular awareness training program. I think smaller companies or SMMEs and entrepreneurs that are looking to establish a business, they need to understand where exactly a policy needs to be documented. And I think the hierarchy of understanding when policies are to be documented are key. The first element of the hierarchy is to be able to look at statutory requirements. And the way I remember statutory is state, the law, the Basic Employment of Conditions Act, Occupational Health and Safety Act. The one for environmental is the National Environmental Management Act, which we know as NEMA. If the National Environmental Management Act requires you to have a policy, then it's mandatory for each and every company to have that. And it's important for SMMEs or entrepreneurs to know that that importance is key. When you're reading a policy, it should tell you what the company is going to be doing to comply to the particular act. It is not explaining how you do it. Those are mostly standard operating procedures that will come in. How's the procedures? What's our policies? Then the next element in the hierarchy is regulatory. These could be best practice standards you're looking to align yourselves with, SANS codes or ISO standards. And if that standard requires you to be able to have a policy, then you need to have a policy in your organization. And that policy is allowing you to be able to control the requirements of the standard in your organization and making sure you are conforming to best practice standards and complying to the law. And the third one, which most entrepreneurs as well as SMMEs need to know, is a baseline risk assessment. So look at every activity in your organization, every activity from washing your hands to being able to switch on your laptop. And there's environment being considered in every aspect. When you're washing your hands, there's portable water, there's disposable water coming through. Now, is that water being recycled for gray water? So you look at the activity, which is the environmental aspect, and you determine that aspect where you're washing your hands with an impact. If there's portable extra water that's coming out, is that being recycled? If it is, that's a positive impact. And that means that your controls are good. But if it's not being recycled, then it's a negative impact and depletion of natural resources. And that is where we need to perhaps consider utilizing or harvesting that gray water to maybe our plants or whatever it may be. Same like when you're switching on your laptop, using power, that's energy. And if you look down to the raw materials or the cradle to the grave approach on the life cycle approach, that is coming from your general fossil fuels. So if the risk in your organization with each activity that's being performed that has a negative impact for environmental performance, that is when you may want to consider having a policy in place. And this is to create a culture in the organization to understand the fundamental values of being able to safeguard their environment and control the risk by ensuring that they are meeting objectives from an environmental perspective, managing the environmental performance, and being a good resident of environmental management systems. And this entire framework is explained in the ISO 14001 2015 version of the standard, which is the standard for environmental management systems. And it's a requirement standard which sets out a set of requirements, or you want to call it specifications, for organizations to be able to conform to. And it tells you what policies to create, what procedures to have, what consistency measures you need to have, and what you need to do to develop a risk assessment. It tells you that. And when you implement that in an organization, it becomes an environmental management system. Now, the most important part is to get third-party assurance. That is when you'll call the likes of SABS, TUV, SGS to independently come and audit you to give you a level of confidence that you're meeting the requirements of the standard as well as complying to the law. And when you get that certificate, it gives your clients the assurance and the confidence that you're manufacturing your products and services within the law, and there's no risk associated with legal non-compliance or fines in that matter. And that is where your shareholders get confidence, where there's points given to you from an insurance perspective, from a market share perspective. And that is where it's key and fundamental for companies who are starting off to implement this in the beginning, so they create the culture. If you do it later on, it's quite difficult to create a culture of being able to be environmentally friendly. If you are brought up at home to switch off the light, you are going to do it when you come to your working environment. If you don't do it at home, not saying that's a wrong thing, it's difficult to embed that culture in someone to get the understanding of why switching off the light is so important. Simple things of that nature is where we really recommend entrepreneurs to focus on implementing the system at an early stage.